Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. After a vendetta with Jack, Nikki becomes enraged and abandons Victor. According to spoilers for The Young and the Restless, Victor Newman and his never-ending Abbott grudge may be the last straw in his marriage to Nikki Newman. Is Nikki considering leaving Victor for Peter Bergman's character Jack Abbott? Victor Newman enjoys being in charge. Since Victor thinks he knows best, Nikki has endured a lot over the years. Sadly, Nikki is growing tired of Victor's personal grudge against the Newmans, particularly Jack and, consequently, Kyle Abbott. Nikki asks Victor to stop interfering between Kyle and Claire Newman, since she is tired of him doing so. Victor has been confronted about the same thing by Victoria Newman. She lost her life with Cole Howard as a result of Victor's years-long abuse of her. Since Victor and Nikki will undoubtedly disagree on anything pertaining to Jack, Victor has now made a choice that could end their marriage. Victor Newman is interested in working with Kane Ashby. Victor now intends to work with Kane Ashby to pursue Jack and seize control of Jabot in order to safeguard Newman. Nikki is completely opposed to this concept. Nikki has previously been told by Victor that Kane told him that she nearly gave him Chancellor in order to save Nick Newman. Victor didn't like that she didn't ask him first. At last, Victor conceded and stated he didn't mind if she offered that in order to preserve his son. Victor, however, established the rule that she cannot do so in order to save Jack since he will not tolerate it. When Nikki refused to go to treatment for Victor, Jack was able to persuade her to do so, which Victor detests. As a result, Jack-Victor became his worst enemy. Newman, Victor targeting the Jabot is easy. For years, Jack and Victor have been at odds. Victor has no trouble pursuing Jack because of this. Victor is even more enraged by the fact that Jack and Nikki are close friends. Victor refuses to acknowledge that Jack was the one who saved Nikki's life. Rather, Victor claims that Jack was putting Nikki in risk by using medicines to make her see her current state. Nikki is not going to stand by and watch Jack lose Jabot, as Victor wants her to. Nikki might easily cause trouble by informing Jack about Victor's activities. If Nikki revealed the plans she had with Kane, Victor would be incensed. Nikki and Victor may end up in divorce court if Victor doesn't back down. Will Victor ruin their union in order to hold Jack accountable for protecting his wife? Nikki Newman had endured decades of Victor Newman's stubbornness, arrogance, and iron-fisted approach to family and business, but after his latest vendetta with Jack Abbott, she found herself standing at the edge of a breaking point she never imagined she would reach. For years, Victor's hatred of Jack had poisoned their marriage, infiltrating every conversation, every family dinner, and every boardroom move that had anything to do with Newman Enterprises or Jabot Cosmetics. Victor loved power the way most men loved oxygen, and Jack Abbott, with his charm and his seemingly endless ability to rise from the ashes, represented the one opponent Victor could never completely vanquish. Their rivalry had consumed not only Newman and Jabot but also the very foundations of the Newman household. And Nikki had finally begun to realize that her husband's obsession was costing her everything, her peace of mind, her dignity, and now, perhaps, her loyalty to him. Spoilers had whispered for weeks that Nikki might consider abandoning Victor for Jack, and while Nikki herself never dreamed she would allow the rumor mill of Genoa City to dictate her actions, the idea was beginning to feel less like gossip and more like fate. After all, Jack had been there when Victor wasn't. Jack had been the one to comfort her when the weight of Victor's controlling behavior grew too heavy. Jack had been the one to coax her into treatment when Victor had dismissed her needs as secondary to his warpath against the Abbotts. And now, as Victor set his sights on yet another reckless scheme, teaming up with Kane Ashby in a brazen attempt to wrest Jabot from Jack's hands, Nikki found herself both enraged and exhausted, wondering how much more of this Newman vs. Abbott saga she could endure. Victor Newman enjoyed being in charge. Everyone in Genoa City knew that. From his perspective, control equaled protection, and power equaled survival. To Victor, family loyalty was non-negotiable, but his definition of loyalty was often skewed to fit his own ambitions. Nikki had stood by him through scandal after scandal, betrayal after betrayal, even through moments when his actions had left her humiliated or heartbroken. Yet, as she watched him manipulate Kyle Abbott's personal life by inserting himself into Kyle and Claire Newman's relationship, Nikki realized this was no longer about business, it was about Victor's unrelenting desire to crush Jack at any cost. Nikki had asked Victor more than once to stop interfering between Kyle and Claire, pointing out that their young love did not need to be another pawn in his vendetta. But Victor brushed her off, claiming he knew best, the same tired refrain he had been using since the day they met. Victoria Newman had confronted him as well, reminding him that his abuse of power had already cost her dearly. Her relationship with Cole Howard had been sacrificed on the altar of Victor's ego years ago. How many more lives would he dismantle before he finally understood the damage he was doing? The truth was undeniable. Any matter involving Jack Abbott would send Victor into a tailspin of rage and manipulation. Nikki saw it, Victoria saw it, even Nick and Adam saw it. Yet Victor refused to acknowledge it. Instead, he dug in deeper. His latest scheme was as bold as it was reckless, an alliance with Kane Ashby, a man whose moral compass shifted with the wind. Victor intended to use Kane to infiltrate Jabot, undermine Jack, and ultimately seize control of the company under the guise of protecting Newman Enterprises. Nikki recoiled at the idea. Kane was hardly trustworthy, and to align Newman with him was a dangerous gamble. But Victor, in his typical fashion, dismissed Nikki's concerns. In fact, he reminded her bitterly of a past incident. Kane had once told Victor that Nikki nearly handed over Chancellor Industries to him in a desperate bid to save Nick Newman. Though Victor had ultimately relented, giving Nikki permission to do whatever it took to protect their son, he had laid down one immovable law: she could never, under any circumstances, betray him in order to save Jack Abbott. That warning, more than anything, illuminated the depth of Victor's resentment. Jack had not only challenged him in business but had also dared to touch the heart of the one woman Victor believed belonged solely to him, Nikki. When Nikki had refused Victor's demands to enter treatment, it was Jack who gently, patiently convinced her to get the help she needed. Victor saw that as a betrayal, an unforgivable trespass. To him, Jack was not her savior but her corrupter. He twisted Jack's compassion into a weapon, insisting that Jack had used Nikki's struggles as a way to manipulate her and weaken Victor's hold over his wife. In Victor's eyes, this wasn't just business, it was war. And now, with Kane by his side, Victor felt emboldened to strike at Jack once again, targeting Jabot with the kind of ruthless efficiency that had made him a titan in the first place. For decades, the feud between Victor and Jack had been a hallmark of Genoa city life. Boardroom takeovers, courtroom battles, personal betrayals, nothing had ever been off the table in their endless tug-of-war. But Nikki had reached a breaking point. She was sick of watching her husband pour all his energy into destroying Jack while ignoring the very real cracks forming in their own marriage. She was sick of hearing Victor dismiss Jack's role in saving her life, rewriting history to cast Jack as the villain. She knew the truth. Jack had seen her slipping, had recognized her fragility, and had been the one to step in when Victor had been too consumed with pride to acknowledge her pain. To Nikki, that mattered. To Victor, it was treason. As Victor plotted with Kane, Nikki quietly weighed her options. She knew she could cause Victor immense pain simply by revealing his plans to Jack. She knew that if she went to Jack with the information about Kane and Victor's plot, Jack could prepare a counterattack and safeguard Jabot from the hostile move. The thought of betraying her husband in that way was terrifying, but so was the idea of standing by and watching him destroy another man's legacy just to satisfy his grudge. Jack was no saint, Nikki knew that better than anyone, but his bond with her was genuine, rooted in mutual respect and empathy. He had been her confidant, her protector, and yes, at times, the love of her life. Could she really keep betraying herself just to remain loyal to Victor's endless vendetta? The answer was becoming clearer with every passing day. Victor's inability to let go of his hatred for Jack was driving a wedge between them so deep it might never be repaired. Nikki had begun to imagine what life might look like without Victor, without the constant scheming, the manipulation, the suffocating control. Divorce was not a word she threw around lightly, but it lingered on the edges of her mind now, impossible to ignore. What if she did leave him? What if she chose peace over war, freedom over chains, Jack over Victor? The very thought was enough to make her tremble, not just with fear but with possibility. Victor Newman had always prided himself on being untouchable, the great Victor Newman who could crush competitors, manipulate allies, and bend even his own children to his will. But what if the one person he had always assumed would stand by him, Nikki, finally said enough was enough? That was the one move Victor would never see coming, and it might be the only way to save herself from being dragged down by his vendetta. Nikki knew that if she revealed Victor's plan to Jack, the fallout would be catastrophic. Victor would be livid, perhaps unforgivably so. But she also knew that staying silent meant complicity, and complicity was something her soul could no longer endure. Would Victor really destroy his marriage just to hold Jack accountable for saving her life? Would he sacrifice Nikki's love and loyalty on the altar of his ego? Nikki was beginning to think the answer was yes. And if that was true, then perhaps the only way forward was to walk away, to abandon Victor, not out of weakness, but out of strength. For once in her life, Nikki Newman was ready to put herself first, and if that meant betraying Victor in order to protect Jack, then so be it. The vendetta that had defined Victor Newman's life for decades might ultimately be the very thing that ended his marriage. Nikki Newman couldn't shake the heaviness in her chest after her latest confrontation with Victor. She had begged him to reconsider his alliance with Kane Ashby, to think about what it would mean not only for their marriage but for Newman Enterprises itself. Kane was unpredictable, a man with too many shifting loyalties, someone who had already burned bridges with Jill, Lily, and even his own children. And yet Victor saw him as a tool, a weapon to aim directly at Jack Abbott and Jabot. Nikki tried to reason with him, her voice shaking with both anger and sorrow, but Victor had brushed her off with that cold dismissiveness that still cut her after all these years. "I know what I'm doing, Nikki," he had said, leaning across his desk with that imperious glare that brooked no argument. "I will not sit idly by while Jack Abbott undermines me, undermines us." The word us had stung. When Victor said us, he meant him. Nikki knew it, and he knew it. His obsession with control, his inability to separate his vendetta from their marriage, was unraveling the bond they had fought so hard to preserve. For the first time, Nikki realized she wasn't just angry with Victor, she was exhausted. And exhaustion, she knew, was the kind of thing that didn't just fade with apologies or grand gestures. Exhaustion was permanent. That night, Nikki found herself staring into her vanity mirror, her reflection staring back with tired eyes. She thought about all the times Victor's obsessions had nearly destroyed them. The countless battles over business, the betrayals, the manipulations, the lies. She remembered how many times she had forgiven him, how many times she had told herself that love was about endurance, about weathering storms no matter how violent. But what if she had been wrong? What if love was about knowing when to stop drowning? Jack's voice haunted her as she sat there in silence. "You deserve peace, Nikki. You deserve someone who listens." He had said those words gently once, not as a seduction but as an observation. She hadn't allowed herself to believe him then, but now, as she stared into her own weary reflection, she began to wonder if he had been right. Meanwhile, Victor was already moving forward with his scheme. He had invited Kane into his office at Newman, the two men shaking hands with a mixture of mistrust and ambition. Kane, always eager to reinvent himself, had pledged his loyalty, promising Victor that he could deliver the inside track at Jabot. He spoke confidently, as though his history of betrayal and scandal had somehow prepared him for this moment. Victor, blinded by his hatred for Jack, chose to believe him. To Victor, Kane's checkered past made him the perfect ally, ruthless, unprincipled, and hungry. If Kane was willing to play dirty, then he was exactly the kind of man Victor wanted in his corner. The problem, of course, was that Kane wasn't trustworthy. He never had been. Nikki knew it, Jack knew it, even Jill would have told Victor the same if he'd cared to listen. But Victor didn't care. His vendetta against Jack was the only thing he could see, the only thing that mattered. Jack, for his part, sensed something brewing. He always did. Years of battling Victor had given him a sixth sense for when the great Victor Newman was plotting against him, and lately, that sense had been tingling. He had noticed Kane sniffing around, asking questions at Jabot, trying to ingratiate himself with employees who wanted nothing to do with him. Jack had raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for the pieces to fall into place. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Nikki was on the verge of breaking her silence. She had overheard enough of Victor's conversations to know exactly what was coming. And while part of her wanted to stay loyal to her husband, another part of her, the part that was tired of being complicit in his wars, was ready to betray him. It was a dangerous line to cross, and Nikki knew it. Victor's temper was legendary. If she went to Jack, If she exposed Victor's alliance with Kane, the fallout would be nuclear. Victor would never forgive her. Their marriage might end on the spot. But what was the alternative? To sit quietly while Victor dismantled Jack's company? To watch him humiliate a man who had only ever shown her kindness? Nikki couldn't do it. Not anymore. She had stayed silent for too long, and silence had become its own kind of betrayal, of herself, of her values, of the life she wanted to live. Her decision weighed on her for days. She avoided Victor's eyes at dinner, answered his questions with short responses, and buried herself in her work at the Newman media offices. He noticed, of course. Victor noticed everything. "You've been distracted lately," he said one evening, his voice deceptively calm. "Something on your mind?" Nikki wanted to scream at him, to tell him that yes, something was on her mind, him. His obsession, his control, his vendetta. But instead, she smiled faintly and said she was tired. Tired. The word was true in ways he couldn't even begin to imagine. One afternoon, Nikki found herself at society, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she barely tasted. Jack walked in, his presence filling the room the way it always did. Charming, disarming, confident. When he saw her, his face softened. "Nikki," he said, sliding into the chair across from her. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders." For a moment, Nikki nearly broke. She wanted to tell him everything, to confess that Victor was plotting with Kane to take Jabot. She wanted to warn him, to protect him. But she hesitated, her loyalty to Victor warring with her exhaustion. Jack reached across the table, his hand brushing hers, steady and reassuring. "You don't have to carry it alone," he whispered. And in that moment, Nikki realized she was standing at the edge of a choice that would define the rest of her life. Victor, oblivious to Nikki's inner turmoil, doubled down on his scheme. He began pulling strings behind the scenes, arranging for Kane to gain access to confidential Jabot information, plotting moves that would destabilize Jack's leadership. He spoke to Adam in cryptic tones, hinting at a major shift in power that was coming soon. He barked orders at Michael Baldwin, instructing him to prepare for legal maneuvering. He even dropped subtle hints to Kyle, trying to turn Jack's own son against him by suggesting that Jabot would be stronger under Newman's protection. It was vintage Victor, manipulative, calculating, relentless. But for the first time in their long marriage, Nikki no longer admired his brilliance. She saw it for what it was, destruction. The tension in the Newman household grew unbearable. Victoria, ever skeptical of her father's obsessions, confronted him again, warning him that his pursuit of Jack would come at too high a price. Nick, too, voiced concern, reminding Victor that Kane couldn't be trusted. But Victor dismissed them all, insisting that this was about legacy, about protecting the Newman name. Nikki listened to these arguments in silence, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She knew what she had to do, but doing it meant crossing a line she might never return from. Finally, late one night, Nikki made her choice. She picked up her phone, her hands trembling, and dialed Jack's number. When he answered, his voice warm and concerned, she closed her eyes and whispered the words that would change everything. "Victor is working with Kane. He's coming for Jabot. You need to be ready." There was silence on the line, heavy and thick. Then Jack spoke softly, his tone equal parts gratitude and shock. "Nikki, are you sure you know what this means?" She did. She knew it meant the end of her marriage. She knew it meant war. But she also knew it was the only way she could live with herself. The next morning, Victor sensed the shift. He could feel it in the air, the way Nikki moved through the house with a quiet determination. He didn't know yet what she had done, but he would. Victor Newman always found out. And when he did, there would be no turning back. Nikki had crossed the line, and the vendetta that had consumed Victor for decades was about to consume their marriage as well. Victor Newman had always trusted his instincts, and now they screamed at him that something was wrong. He could sense Nikki's silence wasn't the calm of loyalty, it was the storm of betrayal. Her eyes no longer met his when he spoke of Kane. Her smile was faint and distracted, her touch cool. Victor had seen allies turn into enemies countless times before. He could smell duplicity like smoke before a fire. And Nikki, the one woman he believed would never stand against him, was giving off the same signals he had long ago learned to read in boardrooms and battlefields. He didn't confront her immediately. No, Victor preferred certainty before he made his move. Instead, he set Michael Baldwin on a discreet assignment: watch Nikki, trace her movements, and report back. If she had gone to Jack Abbott with his plans, Victor would know. Nikki, meanwhile, carried herself with outward calm but inward dread. Every word, every glance with Victor felt like walking through a minefield. She had told Jack the truth, and he had already begun shoring up Jabot's defenses, reviewing contracts, pulling his legal team into late-night meetings, even subtly questioning Kane's sudden appearances. Jack never said it aloud, but his gratitude toward Nikki was written across his face the next time they met. "You've given me a fighting chance," he said softly, his hand lingering on hers a second too long. Nikki felt the warmth of his touch, the comfort of being seen and heard, and for a fleeting moment she let herself imagine a life where she wasn't chained to Victor's vendettas. But the fantasy dissolved as quickly as it came. Victor would find out. He always did. And when he did, she would pay. The tension finally boiled over at the Newman ranch. Victor confronted Nikki late one evening, his voice low, almost deceptively gentle. "You've been distant, my darling. Is there something you'd like to tell me?" Nikki's heart pounded in her chest, her throat tightening with fear. She could lie, she could deny, but the look in Victor's eyes told her he already knew. When she said nothing, his expression hardened. "You went to Jack," he declared, his tone a mix of rage and disbelief. "You betrayed me, for him." Nikki rose from her chair, trembling but resolute. "I didn't betray you, Victor. I saved myself. I saved Jack from your obsession. I can't stand by and watch you destroy another man's life just to satisfy your pride." Her voice cracked, but her words rang with truth. Victor's face darkened, the great titan of Newman reduced in that moment to a man wounded by his wife's defiance. "After everything I've done for you, after all the battles I've fought, you side with Jack Abbott." His voice thundered through the room. Nikki's tears threatened, but she didn't falter. "I'm not siding with Jack. I'm siding with myself. And if you can't see the difference, then maybe we don't have a marriage anymore." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Victor's sharp intake of breath. For the first time in decades, Nikki Newman had defied Victor openly, without fear. And as Victor turned away, his fists clenched, his mind already racing toward retaliation, Nikki realized the marriage that had endured more storms than most was finally standing on the brink of collapse.